We're picking up again with the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, verse 3. As we read last week, John was told, "And I will appoint my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth." They're the two olive trees and the two lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. We don't know who's speaking to John, but we assume it's either Jesus or God the Father, since the prophetic witnesses are identified as mine. Last time I checked, angels don't have their own prophetic witness. Now, one thing I failed to point out last week in our math lesson is that while we're not told why in some instances the time referenced is 42 months, others it's 1260 days, it's not entirely ambiguous. The 1260 days of chapters 11 and 12 are employed when God's people are referenced. The 42 months in chapters 11 and 13, well, that's used when implicating the action of God's adversaries. You could say it's the same event told from two different perspectives, such that while the nations are trampling the holy city for 42 months, at the very same time, for 1260 days, God's witnesses prophesy. The implication is that while God's people may be trampled, the trampling is not just passively endured, but actively opposed with prophetic witness. You can imagine something like the civil rights marches of the 60s, the marchers sprayed with hoses and attacked by dogs while King and the other civil rights leaders called out the actions of the segregationists. Now, speaking of prophetic leaders, I mentioned some potential identities for these witnesses last time, notably Elijah and Moses. But let's remember, Malachi chapter 4 spoke of Elijah's return, stating, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." Now, if there was ever a time to expect flesh and blood Elijah, it was then. But John the Baptist wasn't Elijah incarnate. Rather, Luke tells us that he would come in the spirit and power of Elijah. In all likelihood, that's what we're to assume by these actions, not the prophets themselves. Now, the reference to olive trees and lampstands in verse 4 sounds a lot like Zechariah chapter 4. There, Zechariah was questioned, "What do you see?" He answered, "I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lamps on it with 7 channels to the lamps. Also, there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl, the other on its left." Now, while Zechariah wasn't explicitly told what the lampstand and the olive trees represent, the best guess is it's the community of God's people. Wouldn't that make sense of the witnesses in Revelation 11? That the 2 witnesses are 2 lampstands? We've already learned back in Revelation 1 that lampstands represent the church. Now, it's hard to imagine that such a significant symbol already interpreted by Jesus would be something different now. You might ask, why are there 2 witnesses when instead of 7, like the lampstands mentioned back in chapter 1? And the reason is the Old Testament law concerning the validity of 2 witnesses. The emphasis here is that the church is a just and valid witness for Jesus. But also, based on their rejection, they're a just and valid witness against the world. It's this judgment that lies behind the sackcloth with which they clothe themselves. They're mourning the sinful and unrepentant, the hard-hearted who refuse to receive their word. Now, I asked at the beginning of chapter 11, how does this connect with the sweet but sour message ending chapter 10? Clearly they're tied together. Again, this message is sour or bitter because of the judgment proclaimed, but also because the very proclamation of that message brought suffering to those who announced it. We'll see how next week.